Ukraine, Russia, NATO and the West. With all the stuff kicking off in the news, the following is a short summary of the situation and how we as Muslims should view it. From a quick historical context, Moscow lies in the middle of what is called the Great European Plain, which basically means that Russia's capital city has very little natural defense to react in time in case of an invasion. And in recent history, this wasn't really a problem. Russia simply had Eastern Europe under its control, which put plenty of land between itself, its border, and Moscow, and it acted as a defense for Russia. However, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the former republics started joining NATO. NATO is basically a group of Western nations who would assist each other militarily if any one of their members was attacked. And when NATO started expanding towards Russia, it bore Western soldiers and bases and missiles closer and closer to Russia's border. And this is where Ukraine comes into the picture. Ukraine isn't a part of NATO yet, but if it joined NATO, that would put Western military equipment just 300 miles from Russia's capital. And this is a big no-no for Russia. Because of this, Russia wanted a guarantee that Ukraine would not join NATO, but this guarantee was not given. In fact, the US baited Russia by implicitly hinting that Ukraine could become a NATO member at any time, and this kind of forced Putin to invade. Someone could ask, but what has the US got to gain from this conflict? Well, number one, it could marginalize Russia on the world stage, which it has done. Number two, it could then use this as an excuse to sever relationships between Europe and Russia and amongst the Europeans themselves. And number three, this would bring Europe closer under the American wing, strengthening American influence. These are what the facts on the ground seem to be. So how do we as Muslims view all of this? First and foremost, war in the West is not based on a divine set of principles like in Islam. In Islam, the objective of war is to either liberate Muslims from the oppression of others or to liberate non-Muslims from the oppressions of systems of disbelief. Western war has no such objective and is done to spread their control over people, land and resources. Secondly, this whole outcry about international law and human rights is a load of rubbish. The kuffar do not care about the loss of civilian life, or else we would have seen the same reaction to Syria, Palestine, Kashmir and other conflicts over the world. But we didn't, because death in other parts of the world is outside the concern of the West. Which brings me on to the next point. The double standards that we have seen in the news, on the football pitches and even for suicide bombing is the West exposing itself and its position on which lives actually matter. The last point we should take as Muslims: if nations like Russia and the West can invade countries purely for their self-interest, why is it that Muslims cannot liberate their brothers for the sake of Islam? Our cause, our objectives have been set out by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where we are told to fight the occupiers and liberate Muslim land. If the kuffar can fight for the cause of evil, surely the Muslims can fight for the cause of good. And this good cause can only be conducted by a system of good, the Khilafah, which in fact was destroyed on this very day, 3rd of March, 98 years ago. It is this Islamic Khilafah which would show the world what it actually means to conduct military actions for a just cause, and not purely for the cause of some worldly gain.